Welcome to our LoadUI Pro 201 SmartBear Academy. Today's presenter is going to be Ronan Trainer, and we're going to talk a little bit about load testing of APIs.
Okay, so we might just make sure that everyone can hear us.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just to maybe have a quick one or two people that can maybe show us, let us know if you can hear us okay and you can see us. That'll be good. Okay. So if you can maybe raise your hands or let us know if you can hear us and see us. Okay, so so people can see us.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to take us through the...
So today, just to go through some of the housekeeping, guys. So again, this class is being recorded, or this session is being recorded, and there is chances to ask questions to Ronan. He'll certainly field those, and I'll help field those as well as we go through this session. As you can see down there in the bottom right, in the screenshot there. And also there is an exit survey, so when we're finished the session, please do add any comments, any suggestions you might have for future classes, any suggestions to improve the session as well. We're always looking to improve these kind of sessions as well. Okay, so, and then other kind of training. So as we mentioned, this is our 201 training. With the SmartBear Academy, all this training is free. So we do have kind of monthly basic training like our Ready API 101. Then we go from advanced training, which is our quarterly one. So service fees, SoapUI, LoadUI 201, 202. And then for those that want to get more one-on-one training or want to kind of get classroom training, we do have premium training, and then this is done by our partners and on-site. And obviously then, you know, for people that want to kind of get towards a certification, certainly there is, again, multiple choice questions below as well. As you can see here, there's up there at the top, you've got the ability to register for such SmartBear Academy sessions. Please do have a look out for those kind of sessions that are reoccurring every month and every quarter. Very good sessions, and again, you know, we tailor towards what people are looking for. So again, based on the exit survey, when people are asking for more improvements, we certainly tailor those and improve them across the board.
So Laura can't join us today, but Damien is here hosting for us. So and myself, Ronan Trainer, and Damien Walsh as well. So today I'm just really going to talk about a scenario. So a story that we'll kind of work through today and lay out those requirements for our performance tests. So hopefully at the end of this you'll be able to sit down with your trial version of LoadUI or your professional version if you have it, and try this out on your own APIs and systems. So what I'm going to kind of just at a high level overview how we would create a robust load test with multiple user interactions to reflect expected traffic. And of course, most of this work is done in SoapUI. And the thing about SoapUI is when you create your functional tests, or your team creates your functional tests, and then it comes to the non-functional testing part of it, you can reuse all the functional tests you've created. So unlike other tools where you start your load and performance testing and you're starting from scratch, maybe you require someone with extensive scripting knowledge to set up these performance tests. You don't need that in LoadUI. You can take the existing tests that your functional test team have created and you can spin them up in load tests and very quickly start generating baselines for what do you expect your traffic to be on your APIs, run stress tests, test your server to ensure there's no memory leaks using SOAP tests and things like this. And then you can generate those tailored statistics and share them with your team in a number of different formats as well. And we will talk a little bit about distribution today as well. So when you need to scale a test beyond a single machine's capability. And what I mean by that is if I'm running a load test off a single server, Once I get to maybe a couple of hundred virtual users, simultaneous users, or trying to generate that amount of traffic from a single server, anything over that, I'm probably going to have to distribute the load across a number of different servers, either running in my network or in the cloud. So if we're talking thousands or tens of thousands of simultaneous users, we're definitely going to have to distribute those load tests and basically use the resources of other servers to generate that traffic for us. And I will as well speak a little bit about bringing the tests that we've created into an automation platform, such as Jenkins, for example. So if we look at a typical scenario, and we're trying to kind of look at more realistic load test ideas. So this is kind of the first of those that we're going to kind of briefly talk about today, and hopefully it'll give you some ideas about your load testing strategy. But if you look here, we have a company, and it's a pretty typical scenario. They're developing a REST API for a statewide library network. Okay, so as the API gains traction, we've noticed that there are multiple performance issues. So your management team would potentially ask that you run some stress and performance tests against the staging environment. You can also ensure that the functional tests pass as part of our deployments. So what I mean by that is when we create our functional tests, we generally, in SoapUI, we generally have assertions to validate the responses or check for valid HTTP status codes or to validate some content in the response. When you take those functional tests into LoadUI, those assertions still count. So you could potentially be getting a response from the server for certain requests, but the actual payload might not be as it should be, for example. So for this particular story, you can imagine that we're going to roll out version 2 of an API, which introduces new functionality and fixes. So the existing get and post methods retrieve and submit information to our database, and the new put method allows admin users to update existing book values in that database. So these endpoints are being called simultaneously, and we need to create a realistic load test to demonstrate how and be confident that our API is going to be able to handle these kind of requests when we roll it out. So after we've done our initial analysis of how the version 1 of our API was consumed, we know what type of traffic we can expect, and then we can use this prior knowledge to test our version 2 release. And you can see some sample stats here. So we've looked at the traffic. 70% of the queries use get resources. 20% will be admin users that post new books to a database, and 10% of the other traffic we're assuming will put updated resources using that new functionality. And from version 1, we expect traffic levels for a minimum of 2 hours and currently at a rate of 100 transactions per second. So already we have a baseline that we can run on version 2 of the API, but we also need to support the execution of stress tests to determine what the limits of our API is. And you should always do this with your load and performance testing, because this is what I expect, but what if the expectations are not right, or the load that those APIs are going to get far exceed that. But by stress testing those APIs, you get to understand the breaking point of your non-responsive server, or maybe a delayed response time for those transactions. A typical scenario as well would be that we want to load test from many different locations to reflect how users are interacting with these APIs from different locations. So how we would do this, so I mentioned earlier on with LoadUI, you have LoadUI agents. And these agents are part of the LoadUI Pro tool. There's no restriction on the usage of them. So, you know, for example, I may have a central server that I'm running my load test from. And I can install an agent on multiple locations around my network and then run my load tests or use the resources of those servers to generate load from those agents. Now, if you have a network with in many locations, you could simply, you know, install an agent in those specific locations, or you could use our integration with Amazon EC2 and spin up LoadUI agents in specific geographies around the world as well.
I suppose that was well, Ronan, when you talk about the agent is you can also, when you talk about load testing, you also talk about like a high availability. So if one of those machines goes down, you want to see whether that load test will actually, whether those rest of those machines can actually handle that load. So maybe you've got 5 machines and you're testing across 100 transactions per hour or per second. And if one of those machines was to go down, can the other machines actually handle that load? So again, that kind of whole thing with distributed testing helps in that scenario as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Damien, absolutely. And you know, we've had a couple of cases where companies have had interactions with APIs from a number of different locations, and say, you know, the UK customer base, US customer base, their response time is fine, their experience is fine, but customers coming from Australia are getting delayed response times, which are affecting, you know, how the API renders in the page, etc.
Yeah.
And we also need to be able to monitor the server of our staging environment, okay? And we can use this information to determine if production resources need to be improved. So we'll talk a little bit about server monitoring in LoadUI as well, where you can monitor and pull back the performance counter data of the target servers, you know, to see things like the percentage of committed bytes in use as those APIs are load tested. Maybe monitor your database servers to see, you know, what stress are they under as those APIs are being tested. And for example, you know, as we're updating that database with new functionality, for example, is it able to handle, or what level is it able to handle? And then we'll talk a little bit about just how to run these tests then as part of your nightly builds in Jenkins for automated testing. Okay, so let me just grab so we can see things a little bit clearer.
So I suppose well, while you're doing that, Ron, so the other thing as well is like take that scenario with the library. You know, you're going to have kind of a seasonal trend. You know, so you know, talk about the library. Maybe you're going to see more people, you know, checking out books and working with books online towards the end of the semester. You know, when they're studying for exams. So you're going to see that seasonal spike in usage and an API traction as well. So again, being able to have those kind of scenarios and address those kind of scenarios is important as well.
Exactly, and I think in the scenario we're talking about now, if you think about version 1 of that API, they will look at the kind of traffic and the history of when, you know, peak traffic hit that API. And it's probably something like that just as a trimester ends, or so, you know, exactly, you know, and I think that's the thing with LoadUI as well, is that you could, you know, kick off a load test at 11 with a certain amount of load hitting those APIs, and then increase it exponentially over a 2-hour period when that, when you expect that traffic, the extended traffic. Okay, so basically, just to give you an idea of what we've done here. We're in the project section of Ready API. We basically created in Swagger. So Swagger is a tool for defining and documenting your REST APIs. And then Swagger Hub is a commercial tool by SmartBear that allows you to collaborate on that API design and documentation. The ability to create multiple teams, so from development perspective or architects or reviewers, to ensure that API quality when you're defining it. But what we can do is we can import so when we create a project, we can import a Swagger definition, or we can grab our APIs from Swagger Hub as well. And if you look at this SmartBear library that I've created here, so we have a number of resources and sample requests. So, for example, we can send a request to this Swagger Hub endpoint. Here's our library books. Fire request, get a response back. Similarly, so if we look at the scenario we've been talking about, where 70 or 80% of our traffic is going to be getting information from the library, posting new information, or updating from an admin perspective, maybe updating certain information in the database with relation to those books. So what I've done in SoapUI, if we move a little bit out of the project section here, and if you're on this course, you're familiar with Ready API at this stage. We're on version 2.1.0, but we define our projects by importing our definition files. We can set up authorization. We can set up our environments. We can set up our data sources and associate those data sources with our environments, and then run our tests against multiple environments. So when you think about this particular test, if we have environments set up, we can run our load tests against our staging environment, and then we can reuse that load test and run it against different environments, such as production, for example, or pre-production, very quickly by just switching the environment.
I think this as well, Ron, is important. When you talk about load testing, when we talk to people about load testing, they're specifically designed. Their job is to do load testing, regardless of its APIs, front end, back end, whatever. But they're not having that communication between their functional API testing. So this Ready API provides that platform to allow you to kind of do that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what we're finding out more and more is that when we're talking to functional testing teams that are using SoapUI, there may be a team of 10, for example. And when it comes to the non-functional testing part of it, there's normally one or two of those in the team that are going to take that on. Yeah. So, and I think because SoapUI and LoadUI tie so close together, that teams are realizing like this is a far more efficient way to work, especially in DevOps or Agile software development lifecycle. So I've created a couple of tests here, similar to the scenario we looked at the start of this. So, get library information. So just a get request that we can send some information, get a response back about particular books in that library. I've also created another test case called add books, where we're going to post, let's scroll this up a bit. So we're going to have a payload with some new books that we want to post to that database, or update that library. And then we're going to update resource information as well, so be it first name or surname of a book, or an ID or something like that. So, once we have these functional tests, we're confident that everything is working okay, and then we want to see, we want to simulate the load testing scenario that we looked at. We can basically hop straight into LoadUI. And I want to talk a little bit about the pre-configured load tests. Okay, so when you think about version 1 of that API, when we released it, we're probably going to run something like a baseline. So we're going to test the server performance under the expected load, and then create a baseline for later load tests. Similarly, we might do this with version 2 as well. We'll create the baseline. Okay, so we'll have our default parameters. I think it was 100 transactions per second over a 2-hour period. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to run that today because we only have about 20 minutes. But we can run that test, have our baseline, make any improvements maybe that we need, and then start, taking that baseline and running things like stress testing. So if you look at the pre-configured stress test here, what we're trying to do here is, we get a baseline, this is our expected traffic, everything is performing as we expect, and now we're going to find the server's crash point. So at what point is, our server, is a response time below our SLAs? So maybe our SLAs, let's say, for example, half a second is we need an average response time. We can increase that number of virtual users, see when the server is unresponsive, crashes or hangs, etc. We also may want to look at something like a spike load test, as Damien mentioned earlier, where there is a certain part of the day or week where we get that spike in traffic, sudden spikes. So, as you mentioned, maybe it's a college course and they've just been informed that, okay, the books are available now. They finish their lecture and they hop out and everyone starts interacting with that library API automatically. So you could run something like a spike test where, every interval of, say, 5 minutes, we start increasing the load on that particular API.
Our lecture maybe has given some good hints.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some tips.
Absolutely. So what I'm just going to do is just create a baseline, and then we can select our load test target. So if we have our functional test created, we have our assertions built in SoapUI to validate the response that we get back, maybe check for 200 status codes and things like that. And we can then add, so let's, for example, add this get library info. I'm just going to go with 20 virtual users for this example, but there's no limitation on the number of virtual users we're going to use. It really depends. I suppose the best thing would be to have a look at the examples on readyapi.smartbear.com website with regard to distributed load tests and some example scenarios of, when we're using 1,000 virtual users, what's the recommendation for distribution?
And that's one question that just came in there a while ago, Ronan, was with the agents, is there any limitations to the number of VUs per agent?
No. So it would, I suppose it depends on the resources of the actual server where the agent resides. So if you have a pretty powerful box, it's going to be able to generate probably a lot more load than my laptop here, for example, if there's an agent sitting on it. Okay, so I'm going to go to defaults here, so you can see for this baseline test we can configure assertions for our test. So we may want to get notifications in our logs every time the max average response time is over 800 milliseconds, for example. Now, what we can also do is we can, if we're running our load test and we're watching it attentively as it's running, we can look at our logs, and you'll see the logs down the bottom left-hand corner of your Ready API window, and we can see any of those assertions failing. But we can also, in LoadUI, we can set up rules to log the full request and response for any of those assertion failures as well. Okay, and because I've done all the groundwork in SoapUI and created my functional tests, I now have a load test ready to run. Okay, so you can see the way we have a single scenario where we have our get requests going into that, hitting that API to retrieve that information. But what I wanted to talk more about today was the fact that we're going to have different users going through different interactions at the same time. So hitting hitting different endpoints, and as we mentioned, from an admin perspective with this library, someone's updating resources in the database, as 70–80% of our other users are requesting this information from our APIs or sending requests in. So what I can do here is I can add another scenario. So let's just rename this a bit. So okay, so this is get info. We'll add another scenario called okay, update resources, and we're going to select that test case that we created already in SoapUI. Okay, and then we're going to add another scenario. And we're just going to change the target to add books. So let me just update. We'll delete that one.
So the fact now that you can actually go and, different users, as he says, can actually hit different endpoints. So you can configure the request and response for each of those individual users to hit the different endpoints.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then, what we can do is, if we look back at this scenario for just 1 second. So you can see here that, 70% of queries will use get resources, 20% will be admin users that post new books to the database, and 10% of traffic we are assuming will put updated resources using that new functionality, right, that we've released in this V2 of our API. So what I can do then is I can, so if we have a traffic of, say, for example, 20 virtual users, I can go 70, 20, and 10. Okay, and you can see that we can allocate that load relative to the different scenarios, as as we've established when we were defining the rules for this load and performance test.
And like with any load test, you're always going to get those kind of percentages, like different percentages doing get, put, post, all those kind of stuff. So it is, and you can see there how easy it is to kind of configure that. As you said in the beginning, there's no coding involved. It's all about the front end, like the UI within Ready API and within particular LoadUI.
Exactly, yeah. And I always think of the lights have gone off here.
Lights have gone off. I think so. A little bit of magic waving.
Yeah. So yeah, I always kind of think of like a simple example, like if I am logging into a health insurance portal or something like that to submit a claim, perhaps. I'm going to have to log in, so I'm going to hit a login API. I'm going to probably fill in some information. Maybe I'm going to hit a validate address button, which is going to hit an API like Google Maps and validate or tidy up the address that I have put into my form. And then I might submit that information. So send my claims information for that health insurance system into a database. So if you're the health insurer, it's coming towards the end of the year where you're expecting all your members to start submitting claims online through your portal, then you're going to create a similar kind of scenario to this, where you have an understanding from you have an understanding of how that API has been interacted with, and ahead of that version 2 release, like this scenario here, you can define the rules and then create a very realistic performance test of how users are actually going to interact with different APIs and endpoints. Okay, so we have the load test set up, right? So we can pretty much click run and kick it off straight away. A couple of things I wanted to just point out as well on this. Now, I don't have an Oracle database set up, so hopefully for the next session we can create that and have a full end-to-end. But from the monitoring perspective, I maybe you know, updating from the admin perspective, where we're updating resources and writing information to that database. So as we're load testing, we need to monitor what effect that has on our web servers or on database servers. So we have a number of different monitor types that we can set up and access that performance counter data on the target server. So let me just set up my local Windows monitor here, just so you can see what's going on. And actually, there was a good example, Damien, recently, where a customer is doing, as with 6 months ago, but a customer is doing load testing, and they were monitoring their database server, and they realized that the database server was struggling once they got to a certain level of requests, and they figured out, due to pulling back that performance counter data information, that it allowed them to kind of find out where the bottleneck was. And it was actually in an SQL query that was written, that was updating information in the database that basically wasn't written as efficiently as it could be. Okay. So it wasn't able to handle so many requests coming in. So a simple little update of that SQL query was able to improve the performance and the speed at which requests could be sent to update the database.
Yeah. So again, it is, you know, you're not just talking about the load testing performance of the API. It's also able to pinpoint any, you know, performance issues with you, as you said, with the with your SQL statements as well, which is, again, you know, something kind of people tend to forget, but yeah, that's a very good, valid scenario there as well.
Yeah, exactly. So if you look even now, we're going to be able to pull back different performance counter data information depending on the server. For our Windows server, you can see that we can get a lot of information back. So for example, maybe we're going to look at things like the available megabytes, percentage of committed bytes in use. From a processor perspective, maybe you want to look at the percentage of processor time that's been used as we're hitting those APIs as well. Okay, so we can configure this. I mean, if we look back at our load screen here, this is our global metric. So this is like a real-time information of what's happening in our load test. What I would normally do is set up my statistics with the information I want to capture, and then generate reports of that after the test is run. Just wanted to mention, I did mention logging. So, you know, I can go into my LoadUI log and check for any assertion failures. So in the example we set up, it was any responses that were greater than 800 milliseconds, for example. But we can also, in the logs here itself, the transaction log, we can configure that to either write those request responses to console or to a file, you know, in order to help us troubleshoot any issues that we might be experiencing. And just one more thing on the logs as well. We will carry across any assertions that we created in SoapUI or that we added in SoapUI. They're going to be carried across into our load test as well. Everything except an SLA assertion, okay? Because we're going to have our own SLA assertions in LoadUI.
So one question here, Ronan, is what kind of formats, or is there any formats for the logs that can be exported?
Yes, I would need to check the exact location of where those logs sit, but definitely that might be something I'll have to come back to you on. I mean, you can generate your PDF reports or export your data in a number of different formats, but I will probably just need to check the documentation myself to. Those logs will be written out to a file in like probably in the bin folder or the bin folder of your install directory or something like that. But I can, if you want to pop us a mail, I can, or get us on the online chat in SmartBear, we'll answer that for you. Okay, so I just run a quick test for 10 seconds. You can see the kind of real-time information here. Before we go into the statistics, so you can see our baseline stats. So LoadUI will automatically generate some stats for us here, like the transactions per second, number of virtual users running, and the average time taken. But we can dive deep into the actual stats here, which I will in a minute, and we'll look at it in a little bit more detail. Before we get to that, I just wanted to talk about distribution, because if we think about, excuse me, if we think about the scenario, you know, we wanted to monitor from 3 different locations to understand the performance for those 3 different locations, I suppose. So what we can do in distribution is I can use agents. So those agents could be running in my network. So you can see that I have actually, there's 2 agents running in our network here at the moment. And what I can simply do is select the agent, and let's add another one. Okay, so these 2 agents could be sitting on powerful servers within my network, maybe in different locations if that's feasible. If it's not due to network restrictions, then what I would recommend is connecting to Amazon EC2 and using a cloud agent controller. And this is really powerful for testing from specific countries or geographies, because you can use that SmartBear image that's up in Amazon EC2. You can spin up a server in different locations around the world, and then generate that traffic and receive the stats back from it.
I think the interesting thing there as well is that actually gives you the current usage of the servers for CPU memory, which, you know, again is useful, because maybe you can see one of those servers, someone's taking ownership of it and they've added in some more software. So, you know, maybe it's not a good machine at the moment to be testing on. So at least you can just get rid of it if it's like CPU is 70-80% or memory is 78%, you know. So again, having that there, to be a quick overview of how the machine's resources are going, is another important part.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think if you look at the system requirements and recommendations on readyapi.smartbear.com, the documentation portal, you know, basically don't have anything else running on those servers. You know, dedicate them to the load and performance test that you're going to run. So, so when I have my agent set up, so I'm going to just add let's add a 3rd agent here, just a dummy one. So if I have my agent set up, then I can look at my scenarios that I've created, and I can drag and drop those scenarios onto those agents to distribute my load tests. So very simply, I can just pull those across, and I don't necessarily need one agent per scenario, just for kind of demonstration purposes. Okay, and those agents are going to communicate back to the server where LoadUI resides over a couple of ports that need to be open. And then what we can do is we can run the test scenarios on agents as opposed to off a single server. And then when we come to generate our statistics, we can get those statistics on an agent by agent level, or we can get them as a combined statistics over all agents, for example. Okay, so just to kind of summarize where we are so far. So, you know, really from an end-to-end perspective, in Swagger, we're going to define and document and host our API definition. So we're going to design it and document it, but once we've done that, we can immediately start to interact with it and run tests against it. I don't think there's time today to talk about virtualization, but, you know, what we could potentially do is we could take that API definition from Swagger Hub, create a virtual API, have that connected to a database where we're getting data-driven responses, deploy that virtual API onto Vert server, and then run our load tests against that. So maybe some kind of, you know, sample load tests before maybe we have set up that staging environment as well. Service V is a conversation for another day, I think. Okay, so let's just look at our statistics here. So, I can generate a report, high-level report from the from the load test that we've run. And this is a PDF document that we can generate manually here like I'm doing, or we can, automate the report generation from, if we're automating our tests from Jenkins, for example, we can kick off our tests, spit out maybe a JUnit style report and parse that information in Jenkins. But this will give a good high-level report, and if you, if you have consumers of your API, if you have certain SLAs with your customers, and this is a good report to share. It gives kind of high-level information. So you can see the different scenarios that we've set up here: update resources, add books to database, etc. And you can see the way we have.
So isn't that based on your 70%, 20%?
Exactly. Yeah. Couldn't think of the word there. It was like allocate the load. But let's go on a little bit here.
So I suppose while you're doing that, Ron, I suppose a quick question for people out there as well. We don't have a poll set up, but I'm just curious as to kind of how important people would see reporting in a tool like this. Everyone likes reporting, but how important is reporting in that aspect? Okay, so there are a few there that have said thanks very much for that. So again, reporting seems to be one of those key requirements that people are looking for.
Okay. There's no polls, is there?
No polls at the moment, no.
Okay. All right. Okie dokie. Okay, so you can see our high-level PDF report of what's happening, and then immediately you can get the longest, so your average response time, longest response time, etc. Skip on a little bit here. Okay, and then we can get down to that test step level metrics as well in this report. Okay, but I just wanted to look at the statistics as well. So we can generate our report here, or once we've configured our metrics here, either in a graphical or table format, we can then export those statistics here using this little icon here, and I'll show you that in 1 second. But a good example here as well is we can look at load statistics over the load test. So we might, and I always like a specific example where a typical user journey, so log in, search by, log out. And we can look at the average response time for that test case with, a number of different virtual users interacting with it. But we can also, go into the actual scenarios and then go into the actual test steps, and figure out, if you think about the log in, search by, log out example, the average response time might be okay. But by looking at the actual specific steps, it might be the login part of that is where the bottleneck or the delay is. Once people are logged in, search by, log out could be very quickly. Could be those API interactions could be working as expected. So by going into the actual diving deep into the weeds of the test steps, you can kind of, it's easier to figure out where those bottlenecks are. I said that in a bit of a roundabout way, but you can see here that from the scenario perspective, I have my, get info from the library, update my resources, add books to a database, etc. And then we can go into our server monitors, as we looked at earlier, and pull that information and maybe graph it side by side and kind of see, when we got up to 1,000 virtual users or 200 transactions per second, that's when the target server or the database server started to kind of creak a little bit. And by graphing those that data side by side, then it's much easier to see it and find out where those bottlenecks are. Okay. so I'm just going to remove all here.
So while you're doing that, Ronan, I have one or two polls here now.
Oh, excellent.
I'd like to get everyone's feedback on. So first one here, I'd like to get a bit more information here is, let's go on, launch this one here. So the first one is, are you currently doing load testing of your APIs? So again, if you are, certainly do let me know. And again, just to get some feedback from you guys. It's just important to see what kind of audience we have. Are people actually thinking about load testing at the moment? So again, fairly evenly split between yes and no. So again, it's interesting to see what people are doing there. Probably the next one then I would like to kind of get an understanding of is open this up here. What are the most important needs for you in load testing? So Ronan's given some scenarios there. He's given some kind of examples as well. But again, for you guys, what kind of are the most important requirements or needs when you looked to, or when you're going to be looking at a load testing tool? So I'll give a few minutes. Again, seems to be we're going towards. Reporting seems to be a big one here, and ease of automation. So again, we talked about that in the beginning, running with ease of automation. So again, moving from SoapUI to LoadUI, again, is something very, very easy. And as you've shown up, it took a few clicks to kind of create a load test from a functional test.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Damien.
Go ahead, Ron.
No, I was just going to say from an automation perspective, we'll briefly look at that just before we finish up today. We could probably sit here for 2 or 3 hours and kind of go deep into the weeds, but make sure we cover everything.
I have one question that's come in as well. If we close statistic report, could we open it again and see the graphic? So if they close the reports, the statistics report, can they open up again and see the graphics? So I think again the question there is that you can open up the report anytime you want and you can see the graphics. So again, as Ronan showed at the beginning, the report itself that can be viewed anytime you want. So even from historical test runs, you can see the reports. All right, Ronan?
Yeah, absolutely, and that kind of leads nicely onto the comparison of runs as well. So if we run our initial baseline load test and then we make some changes and we run the same test again, we can view the statistics side by side and compare our first run, for example, to a second run. If I had run multiple load tests here, we'd see a lot more information, or a lot more load tests we could compare side by side here. So I hope that answers the question. And then just from, we can export the data in CSV format here as well, okay? Or we can generate a load test statistics report or a data export, okay? So of the information down here. And, sometimes it might be a little bit easier to view this information in table format, and we can certainly do that as well. I'll just create one there pretty quickly, and we can, we can get that actual information coming back about the statistics that we've generated. Just conscious that we're about 10 minutes short of the hour, and I just wanted to talk about automation. So for the scenario we looked at, I suppose just to summarize again, and if we want to just, I suppose, refresh ourselves, refresh our memory, 70% of queries will get information from the library, 20% will be admin users that post new books, and 10% of the traffic we're assuming will put updated resources using that new functionality that we've released in V2 of this REST API. Okay, so, we must be able to bring our load tests into Jenkins for automated testing. We should be able to monitor the server of our staging environment. Okay, so we can do that. Requests should come from 3 distinct locations to reflect the distributed library network. And again, you know, we talked about the agents, be they those 3 distinct locations in your network, or else we're going to use that Amazon EC2 Cloud controllers. And then we should support the execution of stress tests to determine the limits of our API. So, yeah, I would go with the baseline, and then I'd run a stress test probably after it. From a Jenkins perspective, we have a tool called LoadUI Test Runner. So it's quite similar to in SoapUI. So you can incorporate your functional tests in Maven, or you can use a command line runner from Jenkins to execute your tests. Similarly here, for Windows, there's a LoadUI Test Runner batch file, and we also support Mac OS and Linux as well. This batch file sits in the bin folder of my Ready API install directory. What we can do then is we can configure the test to run against different environments. So I only have a default environment here, but at the project level I can set up multiple environments, and then we could automate those load tests to run against different environments. Maybe if we're running something like a SOAP test and we want to kick it off at midnight until maybe 8 o'clock the next morning or something like that, then we could do that from Jenkins. From a reporting perspective, then we can generate reports. So from Jenkins, I would probably use the command line runner and then parse a JUnit report. So we can see if the test passed or failed, but we can also get full detailed information in that parsed report about what happened. So if I was to launch this load test runner now, it's obviously going to run my load test, but the reason I showed you is because we can take, based on the arguments we've added, we can take this command line. So LoadUI Test Runner, we're going to kick off this project against our default environment, and we can copy and paste that into a tool like Jenkins. And let me just see if I can give you a little bit of a better example.
I suppose once you have that batch file, anyways, like or that batch file, if you're Windows and you don't have Jenkins, maybe you're a small company that haven't got a CI environment there at the moment, you can certainly use it through the task scheduler or Windows Task Scheduler as well. So exactly. You can do anything with the batch files, you see.
Exactly. And if you're using Jenkins, so for the project or the scenario we're looking at, I have a nightly build demonstration here, and in my configuration, all I'm doing is just running a batch command. So you can see that we're execute this Windows batch command. So this is testrunner.bat for executing functional tests, and LoadUI testrunner.bat is for executing those load tests. So you could generate that command line in the GUI, copy and paste it if you don't want to type it yourself, pop it into Jenkins, and just one other thing as well is when the load test runs and it generates those JUnit reports, we can, in our post-build actions, just tell Jenkins where those reports are, so it can parse that information. We can get a full stack trace. Okay, so we're nearly out of time. I think we're going to have to increase this call to this webinar to an hour and a half, so we can get a little bit more into the details and see more information on the test. But I just thought today it was, rather than go through the tools and the features on it, that we could try and even roughly kind of mock out a realistic scenario of why you would run these load and performance tests. So okay, I hope it was useful, and definitely keep an eye on upcoming webinars on the SmartBear Academy. Is there any questions coming through, Damien?
Not at the moment, Rona. I suppose I had one other poll that I'd like to just maybe ask the audience, if you don't mind, just to get a bit of feel as well. So I'm just going to launch this here and see if people can give me a bit more feedback. So again, what API tools are you using? So again, I know some of you guys, when we asked about load testing, whether you're going to be doing load testing or not, but just to get a bit of understanding of where people are using tools. So I'll leave that open for a couple of more seconds and get a bit of a response from you. But yeah, apart from that, Ronan, we have no other questions. Again, guys, as Ronan says, these sessions, these SmartBear webinars do come on quite a lot. So please just keep an eye out on our SmartBear Academy website. And again, once we're finished here, certainly do, if you have any feedback on the webinar today, please do let us know. And again, we'll make the recording available soon as well. All right. So any other questions? Speak now or forever hold your... All right, I think we are good. Hopefully, guys, you got a bit a better understanding for those that haven't contemplated load testing yet, especially for APIs. Hopefully, Ron has shown you guys the capabilities and features and functions of LoadUI NG Pro, and that you can download a trial of it and have a go internally yourselves. All right.
Yeah, maybe just one other thing before we finish up, Damien, which probably just worth pointing out as well. Any scenario I set up can have its own load profile. Okay, so you don't have to have like just a fixed profile across your entire load test. Each scenario can have, so for example, the GET request we talked about could have a fixed profile, update resources could have a ramp up, etc. So it's fairly flexible as a tool in itself. Just to mention as well that if you are using our SoapUI Pro user or any of our other tools within the Ready API suite, there's Help License Manager option here, which, if you want to try out LoadUI, you can actually get a 14-day trial key for it. Alternatively, if you're a big organization and you want to run a POC, a pretty comprehensive POC, then contact your account manager and they can generally sort out a license for a particular period of time for you to ensure that the tool does what you want before you actually go down the road of acquiring licenses. So on behalf of myself, Ronan, and Damien today, thanks very much for the questions and interaction. I hope it was useful, and we'll look forward to talking to you again very soon.
All right, thanks very much, guys. Have a good day.